Staging can sometimes feel like a bit of a buzzword, but it's a really important aspect of 40k. Hello and welcome to Epic Flail 40k Tactics. My name's Luke, and this week I will be mostly talking about staging and how we can get the most out of it. Let's get started. Imagine, if you will, that you're playing an army that needs to get into combat. We need to get up close and personal, and unless the enemy has made a grievous tactical error, they're not necessarily going to deploy it as close as possible to us to give us these potential turn 1 charges. So this is where staging comes in. We're going to have to spend a turn moving up the board to get there. And by staging, it allows us to set up our units where they can safely wait for the right moment to strike. So it's about preparation, setting up, positioning, so that when we do go for that charge, they're in a really strong forward position to be able to make that charge. Versus if we just run everything forward, not thought about where we end that first turn and go for a long bomb charge, or just leave them in a position where we can be shot at before we have a chance to move forward, we might well have just stranded our units out to be easy picking for enemy fire or even a counter charge. And a big part of staging correctly is the use of terrain, moving into position safely behind a nice line of sight blocking piece of terrain and be ready to launch a charge from behind that terrain piece. Also imagine you're playing an army like Castra Militarum or Tau, and you've got more guns than you've got combat. And whilst the Crutox and the Bullgrim want to be staging in the mid part of the board, ready for a bit of a scrap, if we are a more defensive or shooting focused army, we need to be planning to set up firing lanes or positioning our units so they have either multiple angles of fire, or positioning our units so that when it comes to moving them around corners, we've got good arcs of fire and can control key areas of the board, threatening guns rather than punches, which again is often utilised in that line of sight blocking terrain. Now let's put this into practice. How can we apply this in our games? Use the terrain to our advantage. We know terrain blocks line of sight, as we said. So if we look at this first map from UKTC, there are multiple pieces of terrain that we can use to stage. And with an aggressive army, we can set up behind the big corner piece if our opponent goes first, and then we're able to jump out and get onto that objective as soon as possible behind that ruin and occupy a nice space there. And by doing that, it will be relatively difficult for our opponent to get an angle on us with the shooting, and yet we can sit in that part of the board off of the ruin walls, because if we're right up against the ruin wall, then our opponent only needs to be within an inch of the wall to be within engagement range of us. So if we're off, we keep our opponent's charge as long as possible. It reduces the likelihood of our opponents getting a charge off against our unit. Now on that left hand side, an interesting point to note is if we do that, we're not able to sit on that objective. So it's weighing up, do we want to be on the objective or do we want to be close to the wall to allow an easier charge distance for our opponent? So that's something you'd have to factor when you're staging behind that ruin. If we're moving up, if our opponent's playing a very defensive shooting army, then being right up against the wall may not be an issue because we're not scared of our opponent just charging into us. If we've got a lot of units that are shooting, then being mindful about where we're able to position ourselves so that we can get multiple angles. So if we're hiding behind these ruins at the front here, we want to make sure that we're positioned in a way that we can zig or zag depending on where our opponents are moving their units. So having a unit positioned here to be able to move left or right and get that line, even if by a few millimeters, that's all we might need to be able to pop around the corner. And this is where staging shooting units is just as important as staging combat units, because we want to be able to threaten as much damage as possible on as much of the area of the board as possible. So exerting that board control with a unit like that. If we put a big heavy tank right in that corner, that's going to limit not only where it can see, but ultimately where it's going to impact the later turns of the game. If we've only got guns, then we can be a little bit less aggressive with our forward positioning if our opponent has got charging units, because if we get too close and our opponent is staged behind ruins and we invite charges, these kind of elements, what our opponent has got, what we've got in our army, that will dictate what we can kind of get away with in terms of staging and how we can position our units aggressively or defensively. And it's those kind of questions we need to be constantly thinking about in terms of threat ranges. That's a big part of this. I did a video on deployment, which you can check out here, and movement. A big part of the tips around those early videos that I made were around understanding the threat ranges. So staging in that left-hand flank ruin, for example, could be a really dangerous idea, even if you've got a nice combat unit. If an opponent has already set up a nasty unit in the ruin opposite, so if we're wandering up and staging but we're just going to get charged, then that's not very smart either. So you've got to think about like the threat ranges of things and where our positioning ultimately is, because the whole point of the staging is to set a unit up and prepare for an assault or a shooting activation in a way that favors us. Quite common play with the Votann land fort. That thing can end up trundling into the midboard often if it's got Berserk or the miniature Terminators there defending it, screening out, or staged up behind a ruin next to it to deter that land fort being charged. Then that land fort is able to be a bit more aggressive, push up, wheel out and threaten the whole midboard much more effectively than if it was a bit further back trying to get pot shots as and when. So there's a couple of different examples of how we can stage our shooting pieces differently depending on the texture of our list. Another thing I've seen with staging that people like to do is leapfrogging. So this can be moving the unit up in waves or layers. So one unit goes forward while another stays back to provide support. Similar to the example that I mentioned there with the land fort. You've got the land fort and a screening unit's trundling out ahead, and then the Terminators behind cover. The land fort's going to struggle to get cover, but it's pushing forward. We're confident it can bear the brunt of shooting or just be a distraction piece or apply pressure in some way. And then you've got that Terminator unit in that ruin behind. It's a really good defensive posture, even though we're being quite aggressive with that land fort. What's very useful then is it's an effective way of trying to take and hold objectives. So if we've got a unit that's come out and charged the land fort, the Terminators can then run out, shoot, charge something, and then consolidate onto an objective, which is a really great way to cover more ground. I touched on this idea of multiple waves, staging not just one unit, but several units. It's great, as I said there, to be able to launch counterattacks and to cover ground. But another thing it's very useful for is simply just being more aggressive. So we've got units of Gene Stealers ready to charge into a squad of guardsmen or a screening unit. If you send them out alone, they're going to kill the guardsmen, but then they'll be left exposed. And then the enemy's got a turn to shoot them if we've not been able to consolidate into something else. If we have multiple waves of units behind one another, sending the first cheap unit of Gene Stealers, tie up the enemy, absorb Overwatch. The next turn we've got Aberrants or Hybrid Metamorphs or even just more Gene Stealers, can now charge in without fear of being shot at on the way. And the second wave is a bit tougher. The enemy's screen's already been engaged, can now target more valuable units. Often the case is in those first engagements, you've got chaff that you're being hit with or a unit that's expendable. So if we're adopting a similar approach of just multiple layers, sending in a unit that's very expendable first as part of an initial wave, having other units staged up ready to then go in as a second wave, means we're effectively peeling away at the defenses of our opponent and avoiding the repercussions of the more valuable targets that we have staged up in behind. Doing that actually allows us to be more aggressive. It's a more controlled aggression, if you like, with the staging and setting up. It's allowing us to get activations out of that second unit hiding in there. It's got a really strong threat range over that middle section of the board. And conversely, what we can do is be a bit more metered in our approach, and where we can hold back almost everything until we have that go turn. So this is where we commit the majority of our forces to a massive attack. Often it's in the second turn to then just be able to leap out everything in one go. So staging up in exactly the way what we've described here in these ruins, but we have this massive go turn where we just then release everything at once. And whether or not it's turn 2 or whatever, it's about applying a massive amount of force so that our opponent can't respond to everything at once and going to struggle to deal with everything. Might kill big chunks of our stuff in return, but that old adage of if you throw enough of something at a wall, some of it's got to stick. And it comes back to that preparation, understanding what your army is capable of and having an idea of what our opponent's army can take and deal with as well is going to be helpful in understanding if we need to just go full send and how that's going to necessarily play out. And the key thing here, if we're doing something like that, is staging units in such a way that they can all strike out at once, going from multiple enemy units at the same time. So even though our opponent might have CP for a heroic intervention or a combat interrupt, they don't have enough resources to do more than one, or Overwatch as well, so put a real strain on our opponent's resources in a very compact amount of time. If we leave that for too long, they might have banked enough CP where it's actually going to blunt that quite significantly. And so that's where the preparation comes into it, is understanding when we can get the most bang for our buck with that overwhelming strategy. Because if we misjudge that and go too early, we might not have enough units able to cover that distance. But if we go too late, then our opponent's got better positions, they've got more CP, might be able to get better angles, etc. If you're enjoying this video so far, then check out Epic Flail HQ. By becoming a member of Epic Flail HQ, you'll get access to even more tactic videos, in addition to all of the other members' content that we make on the channel. Not only that, we have an awesome Discord that is growing bigger and bigger by the day, and we stream UKTC events there as well. So well worth having a look at Epic Flail HQ and becoming a member. Transports are really useful as part of this as well. Transports not only allow us an extra degree of protection, but they can also give us an extra bit of movement as well. So if we're disembarking from a transport, we get an extra 3 inches to our movement effectively, because we can get out the transport within 3 of the transport and then move our movement range. So even a unit that's only got a movement range of 6 is going to be moving 9 effectively from that transport. So transports are really great for that. It's particularly powerful if you've got a unit like Gene Stealers in a truck. They can move out the truck. They have a movement of 8, so they're getting out the truck 11 inches and then have advance and charge on that unit as standard, so they can move out the truck, advance, and then charge. So their threat range from being sat in a truck is quite extreme, or even just a unit in a Land Raider. The Land Raider can move and then they can get out the Land Raider and then charge. So transports are really useful behind a wall, can really push a unit out quite far up the board. In addition to transports, so you have the option to reserve units, and rapid ingress is a really powerful tool to stage units in places that you might not normally be able to reach. If we've got a unit in deep strike or strategic reserves and we've got a CP to ingress them in our opponent's turn, we can now position them in a way that they're not going to be seen by our opponent units. 12.1 away from where we're going to get charged by our opponent. Again, Gene Stealers are a great example of this, or any unit that's got the ability to advance and charge, or just has a high movement value, because we can rapid ingress a unit 12.1 inches away from our opponents, so they're not eligible to charge us. And then if we in our turn have a unit that could advance and charge, or has a high movement value, we can get really close to that unit and make sure that we're getting the drop on it with a nice short charge. And the elephant in the room with staging is our opponent is going to be doing this as well. So we've got to be staging with staging in mind, which can be a bit of a headache at times, but a smart opponent will essentially recognize when you're staging for an attack, and they're going to do everything that they can to disrupt our plans. The best laid plans rarely survive contact with the enemy. One of the most common things that we can do is the use of screening to block our staging areas. If we're worried that our opponent's going to set up for a big charge, we can move a cheap unit of infantry into the place that they were going to use. Existing there could be really annoying, and even if we don't go first, it might be enough to push any assault elements back far enough that they aren't then able to stage particularly well. And this is where flexibility comes into play. And so if we're on the receiving end of that sort of screening, being ready to adjust things as our opponent tries to block things off, moving to a different part of the board perhaps, or simply having to accept we're going to use a different unit to clear that screen before the main aspect of our force moves in. Reactive moves are another thing as well. Reactive moves can be a nightmare for staging units because they can physically block spaces and then move away after we've ended a move, so they can reduce how far potentially we are able to move into a space. Could be a big deal. Ultimately, it comes down to what our plan is, what our macro strategy, what our micro strategy might be. I recently did a video about macro strategy, how that shapes our game plans and how we approach a game, and how we stage is directly influenced by that. So you should definitely check out this video here. In the meantime, thanks very much for watching. Keep rolling those dice and stay tuned for more.